Hey peeps, I'm going to talk about my first school district again. This time, talk about the governmental blocks and weird uh, liability issues that we had there versus how it is in Sweden. First thing is that the school that I went to was 90%. The students were 90% below the poverty line, which means that the entire school got free breakfast and free lunch. Um, that's something normal here in Sweden. Everybody, gets free lunch, not necessarily free breakfast, but also almost everybody eats breakfast at home. Um, it's just the difference between the poor in Sweden and the poor in Texas is so dramatically great that you barely notice in Sweden. In So in Texas, there would be free breakfast and free lunch. We tried, I think, the second year I was there to do breakfast in the classroom, so people had to report to school at like 7:30 and eat breakfast in class. And breakfast always came with milk, so you can imagine how just messy that got real fast. Also, we weren't allowed to hold. We had students who genuinely had no food at home, like zero food. Like they would leave school and the next time they'd eat is when they came back to school. That includes weekends. So the school district had, it was against the law for us to take unclaimed food and give it to students. So what we did to get around this rule, those of us who were teachers who actually had some understanding of the real world, is that we would have students who were there but didn't want breakfast claim their breakfast and then just give it to us. This breakfast was usually like cereal, a piece of fruit, and some juice. And so all of that would last a little while, and we would give it to students that we knew were poor or who didn't have enough food at home or their parents didn't consider them as much of a priority as whatever drugs, car payments, rent. Um, and and that's not a judgment. A lot of people in this town had it really rough, and part of that was because the town had water that was poison. They literally would send out a thing that said, "Hey, the water has a really high concentration of this chemical, and so you shouldn't drink in it. Drink it, bathe in it, use it for cooking, anything." And they only sent that to people who owned land. So we rented an apartment and we got it because the owner's name was still on the apartment. But I took it to school and I asked the kids, "Hey, have you ever seen anything like this before?" And most of the kids who lived in either government projects or rented really tight space, they had never seen anything like that. So they had no warning that, "Hey, by the way, the water's poison." It was sure weird that this tiny little town in the middle of Texas had a really high cancer rate and had a cancer center in the town, even though it was this tiny little dinky town. But it was because almost everybody there had cancer. And like all the old teachers who were like retiring or dying, literally a couple died while we were there, all of them had cancer because they'd been living in this cancer town. Anyway, the laws forbade us from giving the kids food. I mean, from giving us kids unclaimed food. We as teachers, the good teachers, or the teachers who had empathy, or whatever you want to say. I shouldn't judge the other teachers. I don't know if they just didn't know what was going on or they were just used to it. But we would we would buy these super cheap giant blocks of like peanut butter crackers and cheese crackers and stuff like that, and keep them in our desk so that when a kid was so hungry, just starving, and they couldn't think, we'd give them a snack and they'd, perk up and be able to half-ass pay attention. And, I got to kind of a reputation as if you were starving in one of your other classes, you'd come see me and I'd slip you some stuff and you'd go back to class. It's like being a drug dealer, except with food. Uh, like I said, people would eat breakfast and lunch at school, and the place I worked had one of the greatest income disparities in Texas. So like the top 5-6% were super rich, and they were all living in country clubs and had these golf carts and jet skis and all that sort of stuff out in the middle, on the outside of the ring. And on the inside of the ring was 9 projects and just a bunch of businesses that catered to the really rich people. They were only open between like 10 and 2. And they would just have the rich people come into town for lunch, but all the working people didn't go there. There was one restaurant that I experienced, and lots of my students argued with me, no, they're not that racist. But I saw them order people who were not white go to the back door to get served. And this was not in the 80s, which is, by the way, when the school became integrated in this little town, which is against the law. There's a lot of things they did that were against the law. But yeah, I was like, that can't be right. And even though the food was really good, I never went back to that restaurant. Not once in the entire 2.5 years we lived there. Anyway, so we would have the regular kids claim the food, and then we would send it home with them on the weekends so that they wouldn't starve. There were other like legal things that were weird. Like we had to report a lot of things, but we weren't allowed to actually help. That's something that we are allowed to do in Sweden. You know, you can actually give advice that's helpful. In Texas, if we saw a student walking alone at 11 o'clock in the dark, in the rain, we weren't supposed to pick him up. Because the school, if we were the last person they were seen with, the school could be liable to be sued. That's an extreme example, but that is exactly what they said. That is literally, I asked the question and they said, no, you'll get us sued. Lots of the teachers were not super qualified. That's not something I've dealt with here in Sweden at all. Like the English teachers didn't know how to add up their grades. The history teachers didn't know how to grade an essay. And again, I'm not judging them. They'd never really had to do it. So it's just the level of basic competency required in this town was not, and in Texas, is not what's just generally accepted here in Sweden. There were also rules about other things that didn't make any sense. Texas had that it was legally required for you to have a computer science program. And so I worked very hard to get a computer science certification. I signed up. I won a lottery, basically, to get to go to this computer science course so that I could start teaching computer science courses in this in this dinky little town. Because it was required by law. Of course, the law didn't have any enforcement to it. So basically, you could just break the law and nothing would happen. But I tried to get into that, and I got certified, and I got all the work done. And I went to the person who is the vice superintendent of the district and said, hey, Texas law says we need to implement these kind of courses. And they were like, well, I think that would threaten our other courses. And I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, we get a certain amount of money for every butt in a seat in welding and in other things and in ag and in farm stuff. I'm like, yes, those are good, but we're required by law to teach computer science. And computer science can count as both a language and a math credit, which a lot of our students desperately need. And they can learn how to make games and memes and all this stuff. And so some of them who are not interested in anything else we're doing, super interested in this. I did a poll. And she's like, well, show me your poll. I showed her my poll. And she's like, no, I feel like this could threaten our other class. I'm like, it's required by law. She's like, yeah, no, there's no punitive aspect to the law. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing and not do anything else. And that was kind of when I started looking for a job somewhere else. Because I love the kids at this school. They're some of the best kids I've met in my life were at this school. Some of the most promising, amazing kids. And some of them have gone on to be awesome. Some of them are just amazing people. They're models touring the world, or they're in New York representing. Some of them are in the military and they're goddamn heroes. Some of them are not great people. Some of them are in the military and are jerks, and some of them are in prison, and some of them lost jobs in prisons. And it's, the good and the bad. But at the same time, I loved the kids. I was even okay staying in a cancer water place. And I have friends who were still there teaching. But it was one of those things when I realized that, it was a little weird that the superintendent was always carrying a gun, even on school property when it was legal to, when the kids weren't there. And he was a big hugger. So every time you'd hug him, you'd be like, oh, that's a gun in my ribs. Cool. That feels weird. But, I already mentioned, I think, that we broke the rules about having non-sanctioned adults running school clubs. We had lots of prayer in the middle of things, and eventually they scaled it back to the see you at the pole optional stuff. But initially it was not optional, and it happened at every football game. What else that was legally suspect? There was all kinds of just issues there. And I recognize the expediency. It's really, really hard to run a small district when you can't get, you can't offer people, stuff. And they were really nice to take me in because I had an alternative certification. But at the same time, it's just, the rules are there for a reason. We're doing all these Robin Hood programs where you take from the rich district. How money works in school districts in Texas is that your tax base, the area that you supply as a school, the area that you take kids from, all schools are regional there. That's not the case in Sweden. You can go to any school you want to as long as you're willing to make the commute. But in Texas, the area that you serve, that you take kids from this physical area, you get taxes from that physical area. So if everybody you're taxing is poor, your taxes aren't very high. And so you don't make very much money. And that money has to be used, and with the government programs and stuff like that, to hire teachers, to buy buildings, to keep things up, to repair computers, etc. But the problem is, and they instituted these things called Robin Hood laws, which all the rich people are super pissed about. But they're like, all of our money that we pay in taxes, some of that goes to the poor people. Nah, that is not fair. Our money should go to our kids. And one of my friends worked in the richest school district in Texas. And one of her kids had like there are four in the world Lamborghini car, and tried to bribe her and tried to get, all kinds of ridiculous perks because they're rich. And I don't know. I guess I'm not able to turn off the part of me that finds that kind of offensive. There were parts that were offensive to them, but they were okay with things that I would never have been okay with. So I guess I'm glad I worked with really poor students, because in Texas, just the ability, the privilege of being able to buy teachers and administrators and stuff like that, because teachers don't get paid that much in Texas. I mean, we get paid about the same here, but we're also incredibly underpaid because the schools that hired us were like, you don't have Swedish certification, so you're not really teachers, are you? So we'll just pay you under the official teacher rate. The company that hired us in Sweden is admittedly kind of evil. The people are great. The company's kind of evil. It lives on the backs of exploited foreigner immigrants. But that's okay. But yeah, so the first school district I worked at, I worked there for 2 years, and I loved the kids, and I loved some of my colleagues, but a lot of my colleagues were also a clown show. And just the level of lack of competence. I won't say incompetence, some of them were incompetent. Some of them were very competent at their job, but were monsters. There was a teacher who was just amazing, got to, state level competitions every year, but also would yell at their students that when Trump got elected, they were going to be deported. And that they were glad that was going to happen. Just monsters. These were sixth graders. They were crying. That first school district was nuts. I am stunned that they've only had a couple of state level investigations there because, Jesus, all the teachers that I'm talking about who were bad still work there. They do. It's been like 5 years and they're all still there because nothing changes. Because no matter how bad it is and how bad you get reported, it's not going to change. There was one guy who was just a monster. I can't talk about that. That's probably would lead to litigation. Anyway, love you guys. Hope you enjoyed this part 2 of my first school district school stories long-term issue. I'll probably talk about the second place I worked here in the one that I worked at for 6 months before I got fired for a dirty joke. So that'll be next. Have fun.